I don't know.
24 asylums, 7 levels. I went through hours of documentaries and compiled the most disturbing asylums ever into one iceberg. We'll start with the bizarre and go deeper into asylums so cruel, you'll wonder how they could be legal in the first place. Level 1. Yemen's chained hospitals. Metal chains scrape across the floor as people move slowly through a crowded building in Yemen. At first, it looks like some kind of prison, but as the camera moves through the building, it becomes clear this isn't a detention center. This is one of the last psychiatric hospitals still operating in the entire country.
This is horrific. There's people in chains walking around. It really just feels like this is a prison. It's not a hospital.
Years of war, airstrikes, and economic breakdown have left Yemen with almost no psychiatric infrastructure. Out of the entire country, only a handful of public facilities are still open, and even those are operating without the most basic resources. Inside the courtyard, people sit along the walls or lie on the ground, shifting just enough for the chains around their ankles to scrape against the concrete.
Asylum was brought here by the security forces, who noticed him struggling to cope with what he was witnessing. He's been here for 7 months, along with 143 other patients.
When the correspondent from the Vice News crew confronts Dr. Adel Mulhi, the director of the hospital, his answer is actually acknowledging the inhumane conditions. He explains that without medication and secure facilities, putting patients in chains is the only way to prevent them from harming themselves or others.
Who do you blame for the lack of resources that you have right now to treat these patients?
The war is the blame. The war which puts us in this situation. And you are coming to blame us. We are not to blame.
Years after the documentary aired, almost nothing has changed. International aid to the country's mental health services has continued to shrink. The World Health Organization has also repeatedly warned that Yemen is facing one of the worst mental health crises in the modern world. Visión en Acción. In Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, a former addict runs a shelter he believes is rescuing people nobody else wants. Inside, nothing about it feels like a rescue.
4.5% de las personas en Ciudad Juárez sufre de alguna enfermedad mental relacionada con el uso de psicotrópicos.
In the Vice documentary, Jose Antonio Galvan explains that in Juarez, there is almost no real support system for the mentally ill. So he built one himself, a shelter called Visión en Acción, which has been operating since 1995 with almost no government help.
Yo creo que ese fue un momento tan sublime, tan divino que vino a cambiar completamente mi vida. Ahí nació Visión en Acción. Yo creo que de ahí Dios estaba preparando mi vida para hacer lo que estamos haciendo ahorita aquí.
The people who end up there usually arrive after everything else has already fallen apart. Over time, they disappear from any system that would normally keep them accounted for. But as the cameras move deeper into the facility, some noticeable contradictions start to show. The shelter on its own is improvised, rough, and visibly run down. Residents live in extremely harsh conditions, and because Galvan is trying to care for roughly 120 people, there are almost no resources. Some of the residents also become aggressive or uncontrollable, and Galvan uses locked cells and barred rooms to contain them.
Son maltratados, por eso han sido tan relegados de nuestra sociedad. Y empecé a mirar, necesitaban el apoyo de alguien como yo, que había conocido y que había estado en ese camino.
Galvan believes that love and compassion can still exist in a place like this, but how far can that go when even the most basic amenities are not provided? News outlets have occasionally returned to check on the facility, and the reports are nearly always the same. Juarez still has no real mental health infrastructure to offer the people Galvan takes in. Locked up and forgotten. In parts of India, a husband can file a petition declaring his wife mentally unstable, and once she's inside a psychiatric hospital, getting out again is almost impossible. The Vice documentary Locked Up and Forgotten begins with a woman describing exactly that situation. She reveals that doctors could do anything to her without explanation, and that she was being made sick despite not being ill in the first place. India spends less than 1% of its health budget on mental health, and it shows immediately. The buildings are decaying, and patients sleep on mattresses on the floor because there aren't enough beds to hold them. To worsen things, Dr. Devar reveals how deeply patriarchal India is. According to her, men who are mentally ill are most likely taken back by their families, but women remain institutionalized for life.
There are a wide range of legal provisions which allow certain authorities, including one's own family, to institutionalize a person in a mental hospital. The easiest way for a man to get divorced from his wife till today is through this petitioning that his wife is insane.
Some of the women locked inside these hospitals had been admitted by their husbands just to conveniently remove them from the marriage. A woman named Vidya reveals how her husband told her he was taking the children downstairs, and then strangers came to the door pretending to offer vaccinations. The next thing she remembers is waking up in a psychiatric ward. She was eventually given electroconvulsive therapy without consent. Vidya describes losing consciousness and waking up feeling like she was turning into a vegetable.
So you were given electroshock therapy with no consent?
Yeah, I went unconscious, and after that, I don't know what happened. But the side effects were like I was turning to be a vegetable. I was not sick, but I was being made sick.
She later learned that her husband had already become involved with another woman, and that the insanity petition was part of a larger plan to replace her. In this case, Vidya is a rare exception. She fought a legal battle and won her freedom, but today, the system that locked her away in the first place hasn't really changed. India still spends less than 1% of its national health budget on mental health. Level 2. The Queen's Secret. In 1963, an official genealogical record called Burke's Peerage listed 2 royal cousins as dead, but at least one of them was still alive, locked inside a mental asylum the family had stopped visiting. The 2 women were Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon. They were not distant relatives or forgotten branches of the family tree. They were closely related to Queen Elizabeth II, part of the same extended royal circle that lived in public view. But the sisters were born with severe learning disabilities. In 1941, while the world was at war, the sisters were quietly moved to Royal Earlsworth Hospital. At the time, the British upper class viewed disability as a stain on the bloodline. Life inside Earlswood was a world away from the luxury of Glamis Castle. The sisters reportedly wore communal clothing and slept in crowded dormitories. But the most distressing evidence of their isolation wasn't the food or the beds, it was the lack of visitors. Nurses recalled that the sisters received virtually no cards, no gifts, and definitely no visits from their family.
All the time they were in there, I didn't ever see anybody visit them. Never had birthday cards, never had Christmas cards, not when I was there.
When researchers uncovered the Burke's Peerage entry, they realized that the aristocratic reference work had listed the sisters as dead, while at least one of them was still alive. By declaring them dead on paper, the family ensured no one would ever think to look for them. Nerissa eventually died in 1986 after a lifetime of painful institutional isolation with so little public acknowledgement from her own relatives. Catherine, on the other hand, lived until 2014, long enough to see her secret exposed to the world. After more than a century of operation, the Royal Earlswood Hospital was shut down as part of the UK's move away from large institutional asylums. Hyroids Asylum. Something strange was happening to the most forgotten people in society. One by one, they were being quietly removed from public life and sent behind the walls of a building. And once they were inside, most of them never came back out. Hyroids in Yorkshire held over 2,500 patients at its peak. It had its own farms, a bakery, a butchery, and even a railway station. Everything needed for daily life existed inside its walls. So people placed there rarely had a reason to leave. And over time, that isolation became permanent. Turns out a large number of patients weren't even diagnosed with severe psychiatric conditions. Instead, they were simply described as socially inadequate, meaning they were poor, abandoned, or simply unable to cope with ordinary life. I'm willing to bet for those of you watching, and myself included, you fit into at least one of those categories to some degree. And the asylum system existed in large part to make such people disappear from society. Joan Tugwell was one of them, and she dared to develop panic attacks and anxiety after the war. At the time, her family believed the asylum would help stabilize her. Instead, what was meant to be a short stay stretched into more than 33 years inside mental hospitals.
First thing with being free. I mean, after 33 and a half years, it's a long time. You've got to know how to go about it when you're out in the community, so you've got to do things for yourself.
Joan describes dormitories where beds were packed so tightly together that patients had to be arranged head to toe. She also recalls asking to help make beds just to fill the endless empty hours of the day. After the NHS was created in 1948, psychiatrists began experimenting with harsher physical interventions. They were convinced they could treat mental illness the same way doctors treated broken bones. As a result, electroconvulsive therapy began to be used on large numbers of patients, often before anesthesia became standard. During these procedures, staff held patients down by their shoulders, knees, and ankles while the current was passed through their brains. In some cases, the convulsions were strong enough to fracture bones. From there, treatments became even more extreme. Patients were injected until they lost consciousness, and this was done on the belief that putting the brain into a coma could somehow reset it. Oh, it's like these psychiatrists are like the laziest IT support, but for humans. But the results were unpredictable, and dozens of people died. When Hyroids finally closed in 2003, it was converted into luxury housing. The grand stone building now represents the thousands of people whose identities were slowly erased by the walls meant to protect them. Out of mind. Armando wasn't a criminal. He had never hurt anyone, never committed a serious crime, and never wanted anything more than a place to sleep. But in rural Arizona, if you have a mental illness and no home, the system has exactly one answer waiting for you: a jail cell. In a facility originally built to hold 300 inmates, roughly 67% of the people locked inside have been diagnosed with a mental illness. That's 2 out of every 3 prisoners. Armando explains that many people in his situation are trying to survive out in the desert, most of them battling untreated psychiatric conditions. And when the authorities do notice them, the response is rarely compassionate. They're usually told to move their camps and keep walking. One psychiatrist admits his receptionist now turns away new patients before they can even get through the door.
My receptionist told me today that she turned down 8 people for requesting new appointments to come and see me. I could, I guess, accept patients and say, come and see me in 3 or 4 months.
By the time someone finally gets attention, things have almost always escalated into a crisis. And when that crisis hits, there's only one place with guaranteed space: the jail. Armando eventually cycles through that system himself, and when he's released, there's nothing waiting for him on the outside. At one point, he tries to rent a hotel room and is told he's on a do not rent list. Although he stays polite, it's clear that the revelation hurt him. Years later, the system hasn't been replaced. Cochise County is still struggling with a shortage of psychiatrists, limited treatment facilities, and long wait times. Level 3. Crownsville's Forgotten Graves. On the grounds of a hospital in Maryland, there are still unmarked graves. And all the graves came from a place called Crownsville Hospital. This is a psychiatric institution opened in 1911, built specifically to hold Black patients during segregation. From the beginning, the people sent there were not just the mentally ill, but the poor, the addicted, and anyone considered difficult to manage in public. The first patients were transferred from Spring Grove, and they literally built Crownsville themselves. They lived in tents, made their own clothes, raised their own food, and physically constructed the institution that would then hold them for the rest of their lives. In the 1920s and 30s, former staff say many of the people admitted were not even psychiatrically ill. Ex-patients describe being kicked, thrown, and dragged into submission. Seclusion rooms were routine, and shock treatment was used heavily.
Some of them staff would punch you, kick you, put you in that room just to put you in that room.
Some patients even received 20, 30, or even 40 rounds of it. Eventually, in 1975, a reporter named Doug Struck checked himself into Crownsville undercover as a patient at risk of self-harm. He was admitted with almost no scrutiny and given a strong tranquilizer immediately. Within hours, he felt exactly like the man around him. This led him to conclude that Crownsville was not a place of therapy at all. It was a locked prison using what he called chemical shackles to keep people compliant and manageable.
It was a locked prison with grates on the windows and locked steel doors. And instead of the iron shackles that had been used in Crownsville's dark past, it was chemical shackles. It was tranquilizers.
And the numbers made that even more obvious. In the year before his stay, there had been 72 deaths in a hospital population of fewer than 700. That's over 10%. That includes a 26-year-old man who hanged himself in seclusion, a woman who died of a drug overdose after admission, and a teenage boy who died in a closet fire after being locked inside and forgotten. The shocking death rate shows that they never meant to protect the mentally unwell. Finally, after decades of abuse, the hospital was officially closed in 2004. By then, years of investigations and federal scrutiny had completely exposed the conditions inside. The threat of Byberry. What the Philadelphia State Hospital used to be was so notorious that parents used to scare their kids with it. At first, it was Byberry. Built in 1907, it immediately became associated with corruption and horror. Money was stolen off by political officials, and patients were routinely neglected and even killed by workers and other patients. Even when the state stepped in, nothing changed. In 1938, Pennsylvania took over and renamed it the Philadelphia State Hospital. But instead of reform, the conditions worsened.
My son had been in the hospital for 5 months, and they were about to transfer him to Philadelphia State Hospital. And my husband told my son's psychiatrist that he would rather see him dead than in a state hospital.
In 1986, reports of physical and intimate abuse centered on a young woman named Anna. When she told her mother what was happening, her mother began investigating, but the institution was actively stonewalling the complaints until the situation finally caught the government's attention. When Governor Robert Casey took office in 1987, he announced that Byberry would close within 2 years. But the closure itself turned into a tragedy. Anna, whose bravery helped expose the abuse, finally received trauma treatment. But a few years down the line, she ended her life. And she wasn't the only one. Other patients who were discharged also followed the same way to die. It led people to question the risks of removing people from a system without a new system to fall back on. On June 21st, 1990, Byberry officially closed forever. But by that point, the damage had already left irreparable harm. What happens in Fairview? A mysterious box appears on a woman's front porch in Oregon. Inside are the cremated remains of 2 people, Curtis Shelley and Margaret Earl. They are her relatives, and they had been missing for decades. That discovery leads back to a place called Fairview Training Center. You see, Curtis and Margaret had a genetic condition known as PKU. So in the 1920s, a doctor convinced their family that institutionalization was the best option. Fairview opened its doors to them, and once they entered, they remained there for over 40 years. From day one, the 10,000 people who passed through the halls of Fairview weren't called patients or students, they were inmates. Physical restraints like straitjackets were common, and the institution was run more like a prison than a school or a support center. By 1923, Oregon had passed a compulsory sterilization law, and Fairview became one of the main places where that law was carried out. So for many residents, before they could leave, they had to be sterilized. Over 2,500 people in Oregon were sterilized before the law was finally stopped 60 years later. But sterilizations weren't the only form of medical harm. Fairview also performed lobotomies. In fact, one of Oregon's first lobotomies was carried out on a 50-year-old woman from Fairview. At least one patient who received the procedure was as young as 13. But even after that, the cruelty continued. In 1979, 2 bedridden women with severe disabilities were assaulted by a caregiver placed at the facility through a job training program. He was already a convicted sex offender. Fairview finally closed in February 2000. But the survivors refused to stay silent, and their message to the world today is eerily simple.
Don't limit me, and don't limit yourself.
Children of Darkness. In 1983, a PBS documentary crew walked into a psychiatric hospital and turned their cameras on a 20-year-old autistic man named Billy Calhoun. Billy had been living in physical restraints for years because staff believed they were the only things stopping him from hurting himself. And at that point, doctors had already planned their next approach, a lobotomy. Children of Darkness follows mentally ill and emotionally troubled children and adults across several American institutions. When it first broadcast, there were 7 million mentally ill individuals in America, and the institutions that housed them were failing almost all of them. One of the teenagers was Brian, who suffered from schizophrenia and mania.
I'm gonna kill you!
Later, during a psychotic episode in his room, staff members tackle him to a bed and administer injections. Another resident at Eastern State is Jerry, a young man with muscular dystrophy. His parents had abandoned him at the institution and moved across the country. he tells the filmmakers how much he still misses them and how much he hopes they might one day come back.
Tomorrow's his 2-year anniversary, and his parents just more or less dropped him off here and said, "You got him, see you later," and took off.
The film also returns to Billy Calhoun, whose story becomes one of the documentary's most painful moments. Because for all the talk of lobotomies, what Billy actually needs is something the institution can't provide. He needs patience, attention, and consistent human contact. And the facility simply doesn't have the resources or the will to give him any of those. Over 10 years later, most of the asylums featured in Children of Darkness have either closed down or been dramatically reorganized. But the larger issue the documentary exposed has never really gone away. Level 4. Rampton's Special. Every employee at Rampton had to sign the official Secrets Act, which meant anything that happened inside stayed inside. But in 1979, a group of journalists tried to investigate the hospital, and what they found was a system designed to break people. Rampton was a special hospital meant for the most dangerous criminals in Britain, but ironically, nearly half of the 900 patients there had committed no crime at all. Some of them were youngsters with learning disabilities, the quote-unquote mentally handicapped, and the poor. One mother shows the crew photographs of her daughter Sylvia before and after admission. In the before picture, Sylvia looks healthy and happy, and in the after picture, she's lost her hair, her teeth, and clearly her sense of self.
She's changed her hair. She's not the same girl at all, you know, she's just bewildered, you can see. She's so upset. She's just not Sylvia.
But the cruelty goes far beyond neglect. Former patients describe being with chains and dragged down corridors almost immediately upon arrival. One of the most disturbing stories concerns a patient named Freddie, who was allegedly kept naked on the ward for years. He was literally between the legs repeatedly with hobnailed boots.
I don't know the staff's name, but I knew he was a Scotchman, and I recognise him even to this day. Saw him, used to drag him off. He was naked on the floor. He was naked in the ward, not week in, not month in, but year out.
Staff reportedly treated those with severe disabilities as playthings for their own amusement. In one sickening instance, a patient's breakfast was mixed with his own excrement to see if he would eat it. I don't believe in an afterlife, but I really want to, so people who would do this to other people get what they deserve. By the end of the investigation, Yorkshire Television had interviewed 115 ex-patients and 41 staff members. They all had similar stories of horror, some much more gruesome than the others. Rampton still operates as one of the UK's 3 high-security psychiatric hospitals. It now holds patients considered dangerous due to severe mental illness, but now under strict psychiatric standards. We hope. Worst ward in Annex. A television crew walks into a room at Powick Hospital in England and finds 78 elderly women asleep. Their beds are placed inches apart, and most of them are soaked in urine. What aired next was so disturbing, it forced inquiries into every mental hospital in Britain. Ward F13 is identified as the worst ward in the annex. Staff describe it with a saying that sums up everything you need to know about the place. The women start their day sitting on toilets in front of each other. They're stripped and cleaned in front of one another, their bodies exposed to the entire ward.
We receive here all the patients who suffer from any form of mental illness. People will become incensed about some of the members of the community.
Apart from feeding, almost nothing else meaningful happens to these women all day. They sit and just wait. What makes this hard to understand is that Powys wasn't even a poor hospital. Just 150 yards away sat a state-of-the-art admission ward. They were funding LSD therapy, hypnosis, and complex surgeries. They were spending £700,000 a year on patients they believe could be, quote-unquote, cured.
Do you think you can do sort of good nursing in these sort of conditions?
The reaction is partly guilt. Why should this happen to me? What have I done to deserve this? Or what's happened to my family sort of style?
By the time this footage of Powys Hospital aired, places like Ward F13 were already under growing pressure. In 1989, Powys Hospital was officially shut down, an end to what had become one of the most infamous wards in British psychiatric care.
This part of the hospital is the bin, and people don't take too much interest in it, but it is really terrible, and this happens due to very poor hygienic conditions and overcrowding.
The word care there is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Eden Fields cancer. A BBC journalist took a job as a healthcare assistant in a notorious psychiatric hospital in Manchester. The hospital is the Eden Fields Centre, a secure unit where families are told their relatives will be closely monitored and kept safe. But inside the ward, the reality captured on camera is very different.
I've got a job as a healthcare support worker, looking after vulnerable and sometimes challenging patients. Patients are detained at Edenfield because there's a serious risk they could harm themselves or others.
Many of the patients placed there are highly vulnerable, including young people with autism, learning disabilities, and severe mental health conditions. Disturbingly, one of the first moments caught on camera involves a staff member referring to a young girl as the cancer of the ward. Harley is a teenage girl with autism and a history of self-harm. But instead of being treated with care, staff are recorded speaking about her with open frustration and anger. Harley is later shown locked alone in a bare seclusion room, while staff stand outside the window openly mocking her through the glass.
She cried like I have never heard a person cry, and I never want to hear a person cry like that again. It was awful.
The footage also shows a mentally ill patient being ridiculed and wrestled to the floor even as he appears uncomfortable by their action, named Alice, who's been locked in seclusion for more than an entire year. When staff make serious errors with her antipsychotic medication, they respond with threats. One nurse casually warns that if Alice throws the pills back up, she'll be jabbed with needles like Edward Scissorhands. Now that single line captures how normalized cruelty has become inside Edenfield. One of the film's most horrifying restraint incidents involves a patient named Claire. She's dragged from a chair onto the floor and then held in position against her will. When the documentary aired, it caused immediate negative reactions from the public. Several staff members at the Edenfield Centre were suspended, and Greater Manchester Police opened a criminal investigation into the treatment of patients. And yet, despite everything the cameras exposed, the Edenfield Centre is still open today. Forces of evil. Barry Hart walked into the Chelmsford Private Hospital expecting to rest for a few days, but just 2 weeks later, he would wake up unable to breathe properly with no recollection of anything that had happened to him. The moment Barry stepped into the ward, he was immediately asked to sign a form permitting shock treatment. Now, he found this suspicious, so he refused. Then the nurse proceeded to give him a tablet, which she promised would settle him down. Minutes after that, he would lose consciousness. When he finally woke up, he was told he had been sedated for 2 weeks. And soon afterward, he developed brain damage with double pneumonia from the after effects.
I had these tremendous pains in my chest, and I started vomiting blood, and my legs started to swell, and and the pain was excruciating. It was like someone had a knife and was twisting into your ribs.
The man behind this was Dr. Harry Bailey. After visiting London in the late 1950s, Bailey returned to Australia with an idea he believed could reshape psychiatric treatment. He called it deep sleep therapy. Patients were given heavy combinations of barbiturates, tranquilizers, and antidepressants until they lost consciousness. While they were sedated, they were repeatedly subjected to electroconvulsive therapy. Jay, an 18-year-old, was one of the victims. He had chosen psychiatric treatment over prison after being caught with LSD. After deep sleep therapy, instead of getting better, he emerged emaciated, hallucinating, and addicted to barbiturates. And Jay later... Another case, Peter Clark, was a 31-year-old police officer who trusted Bailey after suffering headaches and dizziness. He, too, died soon after treatment.
It was very painful. Of course, it all comes clear now, you know. He just wanted to scream out. It was fear.
By 1977, Bailey had filled out 17 false death certificates that concealed the connection between treatment and death. Deep sleep therapy finally ended at Chelmsford in 1979, and Bailey was charged with manslaughter, though shockingly, the charges were soon dropped. In 1985, Bailey received a reality check in the form of a letter from his own idol, the man who inspired his methods, Dr. William Sargent. The letter rejected everything Bailey had built and expressed his distaste for his style of treatment. Shortly after, Bailey drove out of the city and took his own life with the same barbiturates he had used on his patients. In the note he left behind, he blamed his failures on what he called the forces of evil. But for the survivors of Chelmsford, the evil had been Bailey all along.
It wasn't a criminal was occurring because patients could actually remember having electric shock treatment, undergoing deep sleep treatment. They remembered the pain of the electric shock treatment.
The cases so far are horrifying, but the next levels will make you never want to see a psychiatrist again. So subscribe and keep going. And do trust actual good licensed therapists, please. Level 5. Federico Mora.
And now on Our World, Chris Rogers goes undercover in what campaigners say is the world's most dangerous hospital. A warning that there are distressing images and testimonies of abuse in this program, which viewers may find distressing.
Back in 2012, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights ordered Guatemala to make changes at one of its asylums. The conditions were considered life-threatening. Years later, a journalist walked into the same hospital with a hidden camera. Except this time, the conditions had worsened. It was the Federico Mora Hospital, and it is considered one of the most dangerous institutions in Guatemala. From the moment reporter Chris Rogers stepped inside, he immediately captures patients lying or sitting outside in exposed areas. Others are visible through doorways, barely clothed and left in sedated conditions. For years, survivors have alleged a horrific pattern of adult abuse and occurring while patients are sedated. But according to the BBC's investigations, the abuse continued because the victims were too sedated and too isolated to be heard. After the report aired, the Guatemalan government announced an investigation into the abuse claims. But international laws and human rights orders are only as strong as the people willing to enforce them. Because years later, Federico Mora is still one of the most overcrowded and underfunded psychiatric hospitals in Central America. A psychologist's terror. A psychiatrist decided the best way to treat violent patients is to strip them naked and lock them together in a room for days. And the people supervising the process weren't trained staff members either. They were other patients. At Ontario's Forensic Psychiatric Unit, Oak Ridge, men seen as criminally insane or too dangerous were sent for treatment. It all started in the 1960s when Dr. Elliot Barker spearheaded a social therapy unit that promised to cure the criminally insane. His theory was radical. Drag a psychopath's buried emotions to the surface by any means necessary. But the methods he chose would turn Oak Ridge into a lab of horrors. Barker's favorite tool was the capsule. He would take naked patients and lock them together in this room for days. To break their defenses, Barker used defense disruptive therapy. He injected patients with massive doses of LSD and scopolamine. And that's not all. Schizophrenic patients were also taken off their medication and encouraged to act out their psychosis based on the theory that this would somehow cure them.
Their belief was, instead of medicating schizophrenia, let's let them go through their schizophrenia and act out their fantasies, and once they've acted them out, it's out of their system and they'll never go into it again. That's how we'll cure schizophrenia. It was insane.
Things got worse when in 1976, St. Thomas Psychiatric Hospital opened Ontario's first mental ward for women. And newly obtained documents showed us that at least 4 male Oak Ridge patients, all convicted offenders, were sent to St. Thomas to serve as teacher therapists. Male and female patients lived on the same ward, shared bathrooms and showers, and had no locks on their sleeping areas. A later scientific study confirmed their complete failure. Psychopaths who went through Barker's treatment had an 80% likelihood of reoffending, compared with 60% for those who never received it. By the 1990s and early 2000s, former patients began filing lawsuits describing years of inside programs like the capsule and the LSD experiments. Government reviews and media investigations followed, and in 2000, the social therapy unit was finally closed. Level 6. Bridgewater State Hospital. In 1967, a filmmaker named Frederick Wiseman walked into a Massachusetts institution with a camera. He expected to document the daily life of men who had been labeled criminally insane. But what he captured was so disturbing that the state spent the next 24 years trying to cover it up. Titicut Follies is a direct cinema documentary filmed inside Bridgewater State Hospital. It was more of a prison than a hospital, and at the very start of the documentary, you can see men being physically directed to line up and undress in front of staff. Also, I know this is very sensitive, but if you want to see the uncensored reality of these horrible asylums, we do expose it on our Patreon. In one early scene of Bridgewater's documentary, a patient is being interviewed due to disturbing criminal misconduct. His calmness while answering the questions make his crimes look even more sinister. But the most unforgettable moments in the documentary happen when the staff prepares to force-feed a patient named Malinowski.
I like you prepared for 2 patients, for 2 feeding. 2 patients in effort. They doesn't eat for 3 days.
They calmly gather their equipment and tell him he can either drink or be fed through a tube inserted through his nose into his stomach. They proceed with the forced feeding while chatting amongst themselves about supplies and grease and injections. The entire invasive procedure is treated like something completely routine. Afterward, they joke and continue their conversation as if nothing had happened. When Titicut Follies was first released in 1967, the state of Massachusetts went to court to suppress it. They claimed the documentary violated patients' privacy, and the courts agreed. Thus, for over 2 decades, Titicut Follies was not released. It wasn't until 1991 that the general public was finally allowed to see what had happened behind Bridgewater's walls. The hospital was never fully shut down, but after years of criticism, the original facility was eventually replaced with a newer, more regulated hospital in 2014. Allen's Institute. Hundreds of people walk into the Allen Memorial Institute seeking a cure for simple depression. But they have no idea that they are about to become part of a government's secret project. At the time, Allen had a reputation for being a good hospital, so most people would visit out of trust. And that trust was placed in the hands of Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron. At the time, Cameron was one of the most influential psychiatrists in the world. During the Cold War, intelligence agencies funded research into how the human mind can be controlled. That search eventually reached Cameron. Through a front organization known as Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, Allen began his work. But the subjects for the experiments were ordinary Canadians. People like Helen McIntosh, who arrived in 1962 seeking help for postpartum depression. She was referred to Cameron in 1962 with the promise that she'd be cared for at the hospital. Instead, they gave her shock treatments, LSD, and months of induced sleep.
That was hell. It really was. It's something that you can't describe. And when I start talking about it, I start shaking. My body shakes. It's like my body's saying, don't go there.
The treatment ultimately reduced her mind to an infant-like state. She was diapered, fed, and stripped of her adult identity. Helen spent 2 years at Allen. When she finally came home, much of her memory had been erased. The experiments were eventually exposed after patients and their families began speaking out about what had happened inside. Although the program was shut down in 1965, the Allen Memorial Institute still operates today as part of McGill University Health Center. Life Isidimeni. In 2016, the South African government made a simple administrative decision that didn't even make the evening news. But over the next 16 months, 144 people would die because of it. Now, to understand that, you first have to know who all these people were and why they had been placed in the government's care in the first place. Life Isidimeni was a private long-term psychiatric facility for the most vulnerable people in the province. These were patients who couldn't feed themselves. Many of them couldn't even speak clearly enough to tell anyone that they were hungry or cold. Then, in the mid-2010s, the government decided they wanted to save money, so they called it the Mental Health Marathon Project. It involved them taking nearly 2,000 of these severely disabled patients out of Life Isidimeni and redistributing them across other state hospitals and NGOs.
Our economy has been facing difficulties since the financial crisis in 2008. We embarked on an aggressive infrastructure development program to stimulate growth.
However, many of the NGOs that were supposed to receive these patients were completely unprepared. They had no idea how to care for adults who needed round-the-clock attention just to stay alive. During 2015 and 2016, the transfer went ahead anyway. Patients were loaded into vehicles and sent off to dozens of different NGOs across Gauteng. Once the patients arrived, their conditions started worsening almost immediately. Death spread due to starvation, dehydration, exposure to cold, and untreated infections. Meanwhile, the families of these patients were left in the dark. Many of them didn't even know where their loved ones had been sent.
It was worse because it's those who cannot talk for themselves, and seeing them going, not knowing where they were going, and they couldn't say a thing, and I just couldn't help but cry. I'm sorry.
Between June 2016 and October 2017, 144 vulnerable patients died after being removed from Life Isidimeni. That number forced the South African government to finally start looking into what was happening. The Health Ombud launched an official investigation and concluded that the transfer project had been both reckless and unlawful. Soon after, a formal arbitration process was opened, led by retired Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneke. In March 2018, Moseneke handed down his ruling. He called the conduct of the Gauteng officials profoundly wrongful and ordered compensation that worked out to roughly 1.2 million rand per qualifying family.
These were human beings, vulnerable human beings. And if the system doesn't protect them, who else will? It's been such a long time. I can't believe it. I can't believe it.
The tragedy of life Asidimeni is still unfolding today. South Africa's mental health system remains severely underfunded, and many of the same structural problems still exist in communities across the country. Level 7. Boys of Fernald School. At the Walter E. Fernald School in Massachusetts, a group of boys was invited to join the science club. It came with small privileges that stood out like better meals, extra milk, and occasional desserts. But that one small invitation would turn out to be something those boys would regret forever. From the early 1900s onward, thousands of American children labeled disabled were warehoused inside places like Fernald. But not all the children logged inside were actually disabled. Many of them were simply poor or abandoned with nowhere else to go. Former President Fred Boyce, who spent 11 years of his childhood inside, says the kids there eventually came to believe they were a lesser kind of human being. Schools across the country regularly tested their students, and the children who scored poorly were given a one-way ticket to Fernald. Fred Boyce's own record showed that his intelligence was in the normal range, but he was committed anyway simply because his foster mother had died. It was clear that institutionalization became the easiest option available to the state.
It was the easy way out. They didn't have to look for homes for you, so they could just dump you off in these human warehouses and just let you rot, you know? And that's what they did. They let us rot.
Another former resident named Joe Almia wasn't disabled either. He was an child whose own father had abandoned him. Inside the institution, the children repeated the same basic grades year after year and made almost no real academic progress. Instead, the children became a major part of the institution's labor. They raised vegetables, sewed shoe soles, made brooms, and kept the entire facility running. Joe Almia, one of the victims, describes the worst job he was ever given. He was made to assist in preparing the brains of deceased patients so they could be sent to outside researchers for study.
I always felt like they owed me, because they took the most important thing in my life away. They took away my childhood. The two things that you need to make it in life, they took from me.
According to Joe, being taken advantage of was a part of everyday life inside the institution, and there was no one the patients could safely tell. Boys who tried to escape were caught and sent to Ward 22, which was Fernald's detention center. There, the runaways are locked, with nothing inside but a mattress on the bare floor and iron bars across the windows. Decades after their release, Fred and Joe are still not over what had been done to them. The Fernald School was closed in 2014, more than a century after it first opened its doors. And the state of Massachusetts, to date, has never issued a formal apology for what happened inside.
I see these happy families, and I see how much they love their kids, you know? And I can never have that.
Massachusetts, you're not having a good run of it in this video. Train of the Mad. A train pulls into the quiet mountain town of Barbacena and quietly offloads a group of people. Most of them will never be seen again. Locals call it the Trem de Doidos, the Train of the Mad, and it leads people to a single building, Hospital Colonia de Barbacena. The Brazilian documentary Holocausto Brasileiro captures exactly what happens to them. In 1961, a photographer named Luiz Alfredo got inside the Hospital Colonia del Barbacena with a camera. The pictures he takes are almost impossible to look at. Patients are sleeping on bare grass because there aren't enough beds. Others are starving, huddled together in freezing mountain nights just to stay alive until morning. And inside the wards, there are almost no real doctors at all.
Eu fiquei tão impactada que eu não vi nenhuma daquelas fotos no hospital. Todas aquelas imagens me remetiam a um campo de concentração. Eu descobri que o Brasil desconhecia uma das suas piores tragédias.
But medical neglect is only the beginning. Electroshock therapy gets used every single day as a form of punishment. It's delivered without anesthesia anytime someone steps out of line. And the staff reuse the same syringe on hundreds of different patients, which means infections are unavoidable. So many people die that the staff develops a nightly ritual just to keep up. Whenever a patient dies after dark, a candle gets lit in the ward so the workers know another body has to be carried out before morning. A lot of nights, the rooms glow with several candles.
Onde se tem relato que na época de frio chegava a morrer 60 pacientes porque eles amontoavam, protegendo o outro do cheiro, ou seja, então percebemos que a terra já não estava absorvendo a quantidade de mortos.
And the cruelty goes even further. The patients are also free labor. The men are sent out to work as bricklayers for the city council, building the same streets and buildings that the people who locked them away use. Others are shipped into the private homes of hospital directors to work as unpaid servants. The women have it even worse. They're taken advantage of throughout the facility, and the staff who commit it almost never face consequences. When Luis Alfredo finally publishes his photographs, he compares what he saw to a Brazilian concentration camp. You'd think that would fix everything overnight. It doesn't. It takes almost 2 more decades before anything serious happens. In 1979, a filmmaker named Alvesio Aton released a documentary that finally forced the full horror into public view. And for the first time, the Brazilian government has to actually respond. Eventually, the hospital is replaced by therapeutic residences where former patients begin living in small, ordinary homes and slowly relearn what daily life even looks like.
Então, como é que fotografar ser humano sem condição humana? Você tem que conviver com isso para ter essa experiência, entendeu? A palavra que você falou é uma tragédia, essa desumanização que foi institucionalizada naquela época.
Today, Hospital Colônia de Barbacena has been partially turned into a memorial museum where visitors can walk through the wards and see the photographs that finally caught the world's attention. Twisted cotton. A woman lies strapped to an operating table inside a New Jersey psychiatric hospital. Standing over her is a doctor who is about to rip out every single one of her teeth. His name is Henry Cotton, and he's about to become one of the most dangerous men in American psychiatric history. Cotton runs the Trenton State Hospital in New Jersey, and by the standards of the early 1900s, Trenton under Cotton appears to be one of the most progressive psychiatric hospitals in the country. But inside those walls, he had become obsessed with a twisted theory. It was focal sepsis, a belief that mental illness isn't psychological, it's physical, that somewhere inside the patient's body there's a hidden infection causing madness, and if he can find it and remove it, the patient will be cured. So first, he systematically extracted his patient's teeth. If a patient walked in with anxiety or schizophrenia, they'd walk out with half a jaw. And when pulling those teeth didn't cure anyone, Cotton went further by removing body parts. But when all those surgeries failed, Cotton escalated things even further. He began injecting patients with unproven vaccines made from their own removed organs. Nobody inside the hospital questioned any of this. In fact, Cotton publicly bragged about curing patients at an 85% rate. But if you can believe it, the numbers Cotton claimed were a complete lie. Not only were these patients not being cured, but many of them were dying on his operating table. But Cotton wasn't just experimenting on strangers. He had turned it on his own family, his wife's teeth. And then to protect them, he removed both his son's teeth. Both boys would later grow up and die by taking their own lives. Cotton himself dies suddenly of a heart attack in 1933. But thankfully, Cotton's methods didn't last. They were eventually discredited and are now remembered as a case study in how far medicine can go wrong. Trenton State Hospital, however, was never shut down. It still operates today as one of the oldest continuously running psychiatric institutions in the United States. Now, some of these Asylum documentaries have been really hard to sit through. But if you want something that's totally and completely out of control, then check out our most disturbing Guinness World Record accidents Iceberg. And for the uncensored parts we couldn't include in this video, you can watch everything on our Patreon. Link in the description below.